My time start now. Climate change is a huge threat, yet the amount of fossil fuels we are emitting keeps continuing to go higher and higher. That is why in this round today, we believe that the United States federal government should significantly increase funding in hydrogen fuel cell technology. We can see the word should here indicates that this is a policy round, which means that we look at the hypothetical impacts of what would happen if this policy was passed. The way you as the judges should be evaluating this round is going to be net benefits. Whichever side can prove to you they do the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Our plan text is that the United States federal government should significantly increase funding in hydrogen fuel cell technology through finding optimal sources of hydrogen and increasing their investment in current Department of Energy programs that aim to reduce cost, increase performance, and increase durability of hydrogen fuel cells. If you want, we can put that in the chat at the end. This would happen as soon as possible and through normal ways and means.
Never mind, it was about time frame. You covered it.
Cool. Now let's get into the definition. What is hydrogen fuel cell technology? The first thing we can see is that hydrogen fuel cells are essentially a chemical cell that uses the energy of hydrogen to cleanly and efficiently produce electricity. The only byproducts of this kind of reaction is electricity, water, and heat. So there's no carbon and no toxic pollutants being released. We see that hydrogen fuel cells can be used to power cars and trucks, houses and buildings, and can also be used for portable electricity needs. So let's get into the first advantage, which is going to be that of green technology. The first thing that we see happening right now is that fossil fuel emissions are up by 2.5%. Yet the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. Second is that hydrogen is the perfect solution to this because it's renewable and readily available. As I stated earlier, it has no adverse byproducts. It's non-toxic, doesn't release any carbon, and releases no noise, unlike other forms of green energy like wind power. Third is that hydrogen energy is very powerful and very efficient. It is better than current combustion engines, which have an energy efficiency about 40% at best, but hydrogen fuel cells are already at 60%. And we can see when it comes to combustion power plants, so things that are powering entire sections of the grid, have an efficiency of 33% versus hydrogen fuel cells are already at 65%. Essentially, the energy efficiency means how much energy that's being produced is actually being able to be captured and used. I'll get it at the bottom of this point. And we can see that in this case, hydrogen fuel cells are much better at we're much better at capturing the energy that hydrogen fuel cells produce than in current power plant technology. What's the POI?
All right, so do you have an estimate of how much this would cost in order to make this a feasible source of energy?
No, but we can see that through normal ways and means and the fact that the Department of Energy already has programs on this, that the government knows how much money they would have to invest.
It's a few billion dollars.
Yeah. So what happens when the plan passes and this investment increases? The first thing we see is that this is going to be really key to ensuring that hydrogen technology becomes accessible, because right now the main barrier to adoption is a really high upfront cost. This is also why corporate investment isn't really going into this sphere, because the high cost is really unincentivizing. That's why we can see the government specifically doing this funding is going to be really critical, as that's sort of the only way that we can advance this technology. Secondly, this investment into DOE programs and hydrogen extraction leads to new ways and developments in the creation of this hydrogen tech, which essentially increases the amount of hydrogen technology we have and decreases the cost. What this does is increases the amount of access and usage of this hydrogen technology. Now that it's affordable, now that it's easily to be produced, it gets adopted more easily. And this is not only in the US. The US often exports a lot of its technologies worldwide. So this investment is providing a global green energy solution. And we can see this overall increases the amount of green energy in the world and decreases emissions. This is really key because of hydrogen's efficiency means it displaces relatively more fossil fuel. We can also see it has no noise or air pollution, which is really critical to decreasing these emissions. And it also sets a precedent to decrease emissions globally. This is really key because the US is sort of a figurehead and a leader on this, as well as a huge carbon emitter. So other countries seeing that the US is taking steps to advance green energy and reduce their own emissions is a really big motivator globally. So what are the impacts of this? The first is we see an overall decrease in climate change. Hydrogen energy allows us to get to carbon neutral, which we're going to need if we want to stop climate change. And we articulate to you how this happens on a global scale. Secondly, we can see there's a decrease in the amount of local pollution that's happening from fossil fuels. Even if you don't think we can solve for the whole of climate change, we see that the local impacts of decreased pollution leads to better air quality and less negative health effects that can lead to premature deaths. And the third impact is we see there's a greater access to electricity because it's more efficient. Our second advantage is going to be that of reliability and access in specifically rural areas. The first thing that's happening right now is that rural areas lack a lot of access to electricity. Worldwide, 1.1 billion people lack access, and within the US, 1/4 of rural populations don't have access to broadband, and 1/3 of indigenous populations don't have access to broadband. Even though broadband might not seem like a necessity, the reason they can't afford it is because of high energy costs, which is still indicative of some sort of energy problem in rural areas. Secondly, we can see that rural hospitals are also really struggling with these high energy costs. 2/3 of all rural hospitals are struggling to make ends meet and keep their doors open. And this really high energy costs are a key factor in what is making them so hard to run. And third, we can also see outside of rural areas, things like California wildfires and other natural disasters put the typical combustion power sources we think of at risk. And so having another source is going to be really key to increasing reliability so we can continue to have powers during storms, during wildfires, during hurricanes, and these other natural disasters. So when the plan passes, we can see that it leads to this increase in investment, which gives us easier and faster access to this hydrogen fuel cell technology. This is really important because hydrogen, as we tell you before, is very reliable and efficient. You need less hydrogen for more power versus fossil fuels, which means that rural areas don't need to ship as much coal. We can also see because they don't need to ship this coal in because hydrogen is everywhere, they also cut down on emissions in terms of transportation. Overall, this leads to cheaper energy access for critical areas with the impact of a greater quality of life. This increases internet access, which is really key for stopping negative mental health impacts like depression and anxiety that 30% of rural populations struggle with, and access to the resources the internet provides. It also leads to better medical care because it stops hospitals from closing and stops pollution like coal pollution that harms crop yields. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmation vote. Thank you.
All right, again, I'm Emily on the opposition side, and I'm just going to give you a brief off-time roadmap. First, I'm going to go over framework, then disads, and then I'm going to go over responses to their case. So with that, I will begin. And I'll start my time now. We firmly negate the resolution that the U.S. federal government should significantly increase funding in hydrogen fuel technology. So getting into the framework debate. So we pretty much agree with definitions, but we want to point out that significantly, as the wording in the resolution implies that it needs to be a sufficiently great or important amount of increase in funding for this. They never really specified. They give you normal means and ways. However, this isn't sufficient enough for this debate because we're debating on a new type of green energy, right? This is something that's expensive. This is something that is costly. So in order to evaluate the actual solvency of their plan, they need to give us an actual estimate of how much they can do with what money that they have, because we can't access any of their impacts if we don't know if the actual funding that we have for it is enough. Their only response to this was pretty much that, well, the Department of Energy has something like this, so they should know. This is simply too vague, and we can't really vote off of this. We can't really debate off of that. So unless they can give us any specific way that we can know what their quantifiable impacts are with a quantifiable means of funding, then we can't weigh their plan, and so their plan falls short on that. But even besides that, just by affirming this resolution is problematic as a whole. So just getting into an observation of this round, this is a policy round. Thus, the affirmative burden is to propose a model that adequately addresses the resolution. Thus, they need to provide a means of significantly increasing the funding for this technology, not just saying that, well, the government is already doing it. And as the negation, our burden is to prove to you that this policy lacks solvency or creates unique harms. Our criterion today will be net benefit. We agree with that, essentially weighing on whether the government plan is beneficial or if its impacts or taking their impacts into consideration in time frame in terms of when these impacts will happen in relation to its costs. So just getting into the disads. First, let's talk about the environmental impact. A is that hydrogen fuel cells are actually not renewable. Hydrogen fuel cells may be zero emission technology, but that doesn't necessarily make it a renewable source of energy. Rare earth elements and other materials necessary in producing these fuel cells is limited. Those are not renewable resources, but you need non-renewable resources to produce this source of energy. Current demand for rare earths has risen at a rate of about 10% per year, affirming will only expedite this growth. At the rate we consume rare earth elements, and with there being only 130 million metric tons left on our planet and us using a current 1 million annually, with that number only growing, we will run out. So this just means that it's non-renewable, so their plan isn't feasible in the long run. So obviously, like right now, we're just going to see that in the affirmative world, you're just going to be pouring a bunch of money into something that's not going to last and is actually going to create more harms than good. This may be green, but certainly it is not renewable. So let's also look to this idea of carbon usage. Current technology requires the use of fossil fuels to produce hydrogen in a usable form. While it is a cleaner form of energy than gasoline, it is still carbon-intensive energy in its creation. Hydrogen fuel requires significant development in infrastructure as well as carbon-intensive systems to make it usable. The various elements involved in manufacturing a hydrogen-powered vehicle are dependent on energy-intensive resources like natural gas. The mining of rare earth elements, the production of batteries, and any other connected infrastructure takes immense amounts of carbon to do so. We see using nearly as much as we save by using batteries. Second is just the cost of raw materials to produce this. Subpoint A, precious metals such as platinum and iridium are typically required as catalysts in fuel cells and some types of water electrolysis, which means that the initial cost of fuel cells and electrolyzers can be high, and they can't really give you a quantifiable impact of how much funding we're going to be able to do this. Again, we need to look that the United States is actually really close to defaulting on its national debt because we spend way too much. So when we're also involved in a war, when we're involved in international conflicts, when we're involved in all of this excess spending, how are we supposed to provide funding for something that we don't know for sure is going to have solvency, or we don't know if it's going to last? And aside from that, just the net harms of this are the reasons why the affirmative plan should not be passed. Rare earth elements are required to produce hydrogen fuel cells, and rare earth elements are currently not in an abundant enough resource. China has hegemony over REEs and uses child labor and environmental destruction to extract it. China controls 86% of global rare earth element supply. I'm abbreviating REEs to rare earth elements just to give you that clarification. And there are two primary methods for REE mining, both of which release toxic chemicals into the environment. The first involves removing topsoil and creating a leaching pond where chemicals are added to the extracted earth to separate metals. This form of chemical erosion is common since the chemicals dissolve the rare earth, allowing it to be concentrated and then refined. However, leaching ponds full of toxic chemicals may leak into groundwater when not properly secured and can affect entire waterways. This means that we're compromising people's water resources, we're compromising drinking water, and this is going to lead to ethical concerns. Second method involves drilling holes into the ground by using polyvinyl chloride pipes and rubber hoses to pump chemicals into the earth, which also creates a leaching pond with similar problems. Additionally, PVC pipes are sometimes left in areas that are never cleaned up. Both methods produce mountains of toxic waste with high risk of environmental health hazards. For every ton of rare earth produced, the mining process yields 13 kilograms of dust, 9,600 to 12,000 cubic meters of waste gas, 75 cubic meters of wastewater, and 1 ton of radioactive residue. Overall, for every 1 ton of rare earth minerals extracted, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. And as again, to remind you, in order to actually be able to even produce these hydrogen fuel cells, rare earth element mining is needed, and by doing so, you're actually creating a net harm. We can just look to China and Bayan Obo, the largest REE mine in the world. Even more infamous than the mine itself is the tailing pond it has produced. There are over 70,000 tons of radioactive thorium stored in the area, and this has become a larger issue recently because the tailing pond lacks proper lining. And as a result, its contents have been seeping into groundwater and will eventually hit the Yellow River, a key source of drinking water in China. Currently, the sludge is moving at a pace of 20 to 30 meters per year, and in the affirmative world, this is only going to worsen. There are plenty more examples of unsafe mines throughout China. The village of Lingbeizen in the southern Jiangxi province has leaching ponds and wastewater pools exposed to open air. And the treatment facility has to clean 40,000 tons of wastewater per day. So you also have to take in the fact of not only the cost of producing this, but also the cost of cleaning up after all the waste that this produces. Workers are also suffering from health complications due to exposure to these toxic chemicals. Worker safety is not prioritized or monitored in these mines, resulting in skin irritation. And you also see this emergence of cancer villages where a disproportionately large number of people have fallen ill with cancer due to mining-based pollution. In 2010 and 2020, the use of permanent magnets has resulted cumulatively in 32 billion tons of CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions globally, according to peer-reviewed research by Science Direct. And the analysis shows that the global greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions by REEs mining has increased by 94%, and this is something that's only going to increase in the affirmative world. This complicated ethical problem requires deep consideration of who benefits from REE mining, who experiences its negative effects, and to what extent it is necessary. For example, if the communities experiencing the effects of REE mining are not receiving any of its benefits, which they're not, then there's a substantial issue of justice at hand. If REE mining produces such substantial environmental impacts that it contributes to the climate problem more than it mitigates, then there's an issue of issue of purpose. Now we can also just look to the overall cost. We can already say, like we already said, that this is all going to be super expensive, and we could also just look to the cost of hydrogen storage and transportation. Hydrogen storage is highly costly because hydrogen is a highly flammable fuel source, which brings understandable safety concerns. Hydrogen gas burns in air concentrations ranging from 4 to 75%. Storage is one of hydrogen fuel cells' most notable attributes, but also carries the greatest potential for failure. So when we're looking to this idea of transportation, when we're looking to this idea of cost, to when these hydrogen, if you don't store it properly, you're going to get burned, you're going to get people dying, you're going to get chemical leaks, all of these costs are not amountable to the benefits that the affirmative provides. So with that, I'm just going to get into their case. So they talk about green technology. They really want to fix climate change. They want to help with that. They think that this is just going to help because it's super efficient. Again, efficiency isn't the only issue at hand here. Just because the hydrogen fuel burns efficiently doesn't mean that we could ignore the costs of producing it. Second, reliability and access in rural areas. Rural areas just lack infrastructure for everything, and that just means that because this is a new thing and they don't even have ways to fund this or ways to solve this, we can't really access that impact. For all these reasons, we must negate. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. The order is going to be an overview, the top of case, the affirmative case, and the negative case. Everyone good? Alrighty. My time will start now. Judges, if there are two things you take away from my speech, it's this. First is that climate change is the biggest impact in today's round. We see that climate change, the IPCC says that we have to be carbon neutral by 2050, otherwise people will experience the irreversible impacts of climate change. And we see that climate change is the biggest threat to humanity. Climate change results in severe natural disasters that both displace people, destroy homes, and could ultimately lead to human extinction. We see that this is the longest term impact that we must be taking steps to solve, and to the point that the negative team does nothing to do so, you will be voting AF. The second thing that I'd like to note, Judge, is that our opponents tell you all about how rare earth elements are really, really bad. But they also tell you that the usage of these rare earth elements is increasing in the status quo. This means that you buy that no matter what, in either world, rare earth elements are going to be used and are going to be used at an increased rate. Even if you think that the rate is somewhat higher in the AF world, that's not enough to vote neg. We also see that that fundamentally hydrogen cell technology is coming. We see that this is basically the United States, countless countries across the world have made it a priority to invest in this technology and to make it basically accessible for people. This means that the only way that we can try to make these things more efficient is to invest in them, which means that the affirmative plan is the only way that we can solve for the inadequacies maybe that the negative team points out. This is another reason you're voting AF. Next, on their observations on the top of case. They say, oh, they don't talk about a funding mechanism. There are a few responses here. First is my partner tells you that we talk about the hypothetical implementation of the affirmative plan. This means that we tell you that you buy that there's enough funding to create a difference in the world right now. We can still, obviously, both teams can still make arguments about what that type of funding is. Secondly, is we have 20 minutes for prep. We can't give you a specific number, but the budgeting, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it probably takes away from the time that we get to actually spend diving into the meat of this debate. And finally, we do tell you that it's probably going to be at least a couple $2 billion because that in our first speech, because that is what is happening. So ultimately, we see that there's enough here for us to have this debate, and the affirmative team still has to prove the resolution true. The negative team still has to prove it false. That does not change. Okay, with that, let's move into the responses on our case. On our first contention, they only say that the cost of production outweighs. I'll get to that on their case, but this is just, I'd like you to note that their only response here is a cross-application of their disadvantage. This means that if I beat their disadvantage, we see that you're ultimately going to be buying that hydrogen's fuel cell technology is really, really good for the environment. The only byproducts, once basically all the hydrogen is in there, are just water. And this is going to be really important when responding to the negative team's case. I want you to keep this in mind because we see that these hydrogen fuel cell basically things are super efficient and can last for a very, very long time. This means that once we get the hydrogen in there, once we get it installed, these basically a lot of this infrastructure outlasts anything else that exists in the status quo. That is what makes this uniquely good. We also see that you're going to be buying that climate change is the biggest impact here, and that's something that we must fix in order for basically future generations of people. Thus, the affirmative team is the only team taking steps to do so. Next, on access to electricity, they say, oh, there's no infrastructure in rural areas, so they're not going to get access to electricity anyway. But look to the countless programs from the federal government that try to invest in literal rural infrastructure for energy. We can just use those programs. Also, we see that hydrogen fuel cells are really, really good for rural areas because they only require installment and then they kind of just last for a long time. So we see that the impacts here still flow through. We see that respond to that?
I didn't say that.
Okay, yeah. So we see that the impacts here still flow through, that hospitals having reliable electricity, people having reliable electricity is really, really important. Okay, with that, let's move into their environment contentions. We see that basically, as an overview here, again, they talk about how rare earth minerals are being used in the status quo. But we have to make the transition to green technology in order to have basically any chance at saving humanity in the future and reducing the horrible impacts of climate change. We, as the affirmative, propose putting money into hydrogen fuel cell technology. And we tell you that it's a really good thing compared to things like solar panels, wind energy, all of these other things, which require actually more rare earth elements than hydrogen fuel cell technology does. So what this means is that hydrogen fuel cell technology is, one, more efficient with its use of REs, and secondly, again, their world still has the usage and depletion of rare earth minerals. We just tell you that it is going to be a cost that you are willing to take on the affirmative side in order to stop climate change. Next, they talk about how rare earth elements are really, really bad. But again, Judge, because you can use hydrogen fuel cell technology for so long, this means that it's a more effective use of rare earth minerals. We also see that if the second response here is that if the United States doesn't use these rare earth elements, China will continue to do so anyway. Rare earth elements are an essential part of technologies such as microchips, literally most technologies that exist in the status quo. And China's extracting it. So even if the United States doesn't buy these things, other countries will. So we see that fundamentally, this is not a unique impact to the affirmative and not a reason to vote for the neg. Next, they talk about how hydrogen fuel is really, really bad. And there are a few reasons why this isn't the case or this impact will be mitigated. First is we tell you that our investment is specifically to find and create and basically invest in the existing ways to make clean hydrogen. There are a lot of ways to do this, including the use of existing green technology. We see that also the United States is investing billions of dollars through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 and the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 to basically put into clean hydrogen, which means that this is going to be solvent in the future, and the Department of Energy basically published plans to produce 10 million metric tons annually of green carbon by 2030, 20 by 2040, and 50 by 2050, which means this is a problem that's being solved.
POI?
I'm not going to get to it if I have time at the end. Okay. Next, they talk about how it's a really big cost and the United States is close to defaulting in debt. The United States has been close to defaulting on its debt for 50 years. We just raised the debt ceiling and that's not a problem. We see that there are other spending things that exist in the status quo. So spending, again, isn't a unique impact to the affirmative. And since the negative team fails to prove to you why a few $1 billion is uniquely going to make us default, that's not a reason to vote for them. Next, they talk about how it's really, really bad in China hegemony, how there's RE mining, and how it's really, really bad it creates cancer villages. Again, this is a non-unique, this is what we call a linear disadvantage, where basically they've just talked about problems that exist in the status quo and are maybe the affirmative makes it worse. Again, these impacts are very tenuously probable, and also we see that again, they still have basically the meat of these impacts still happens in both worlds, and thus the magnitude of them is going to be much smaller. Secondly, is just cross-apply what I tell you about how hydrogen fuel cells are a better use of rare earth minerals and are cleaner in their use of them. Next, they talk about how hydrogen storage is really bad. We see that hydrogen fuel cell technology is really, really safe if you just use it correctly. We haven't had any problems with it in the past, won't have any problems with it in the future, especially given this investment. So we see that hydrogen, at the end of the day, hydrogen is becoming a more efficient energy, a cleaner energy, and it is ultimately going to be the only way that we can try to stop climate change. Thank you.
Okay, for just a brief off-time roadmap, I will have a lot to cover. So I'm going to start with framing. I will then go on the app case, and then I will finish with some neg case and weighing. So that is everybody ready? Okay, my time will begin on my first word. So right off the bat, we have to essentially address the policies in today's debate and just overall how we're going to frame today's round. So first, on this idea of climate change being the biggest impact, we agree. But ultimately, what it comes down to today's debate is we are discussing whether or not this is essentially the best way or even an efficient way to begin with of addressing climate change. So don't really buy the fact that this is the biggest impact and hold that against us, because ultimately we are discussing, one second. We are discussing whether or not the affirmation plan is an effective way to address this issue of climate change. On top of this, we have to look at the fact that they give you the time frame of 2050. Now, I take a couple issues with this. First, what we have to look at the fact is even in their own descriptions of how we are already progressing this technology, they describe it being slow. We don't have this fully implemented by 2050, so this deadline that they have really isn't going to be met because ultimately the technology that they are supporting has to be researched more. We see two realities. Yes, we have to essentially have a good solution for climate change by 2050. But A, we either see that a lot of research has to go into these hydrogen fuel cell batteries, meaning we aren't going to be implementing them soon, therefore not in time to kind of have a solution by 2050, or B, we start implementing now without much research and ultimately harming or seeing all of the harms that the negation discusses at full force. I can take your POI.
Yeah, do you have a counterplan that's meant to address climate change or anything?
I will be getting to that momentarily. So second, moving on to their idea of essentially how the status quo was already using rare earth elements. Again, two responses here. First, if we are already using rare earth elements and running out of them, why should we increase our usage of them? If we are already on track to be running out soon, why should we increase the rate at which we are doing this? And second, even if we are already using them to a point in which we might be running out soon, we are going to be increasing our reliance upon them by shifting to this idea of hydrogen fuel cells. If we use hydrogen fuel cells and we significantly increase our funding and research into them, then we are going to be increasing our reliance upon them. And the issue here is ultimately, if we are already running out of this issue will only continue to worsen, and our reliance on this already depleting resource is going to be increased. Next, they discuss this idea that other countries will take these resources anyway. Doesn't matter if the US does it. But recognize that in their contentions, they discuss this idea of the global impact. They state that if the United States implements this, then the rest of the world will follow suit. They will look at the United States as an example and therefore also implement similar technology. Okay, let's take that idea. If the United States is beginning to increase their usage of rare earth elements and rely on these hydrogen fuel cells, and other countries follow suit, not only worsens the reliance on rare earth elements and speeds up our kind of use of them, which ultimately is harmful for a couple of reasons. Not only does it mean that this energy source is not renewable and we will run out of our ability to use it, but also, again, it makes a global reliance on rare earth elements. And if we're already running out, this will only be worsened. And if you buy their points on how this will have a global impact, that means it affects every single country in the world, ultimately meaning that we're not having an effective solution to climate change. So next, on this idea of the lack of counterplan. Ultimately, in today's debate, the burdens proposed by the negation, which were never conflicted by the affirmation in their second speech, are that ultimately the affirmation is meant to provide a plan that falls into today's resolution. The negation's burden is to disprove this and ultimately state that their policy in today's resolution has a net harm. Ultimately, what we see here is that we do see this, and I'll get into this a little more later, but even if you think that we need to have some alternative, recognize the idea that having a productive debate doesn't necessarily necessitate the idea of other solutions. Rather, we have to evaluate today's resolution and recognize that it is harmful. Whether or not we have another solution, you are going to come to the conclusion that the resolution and the affirmation plan has net harms. So let's move on to this idea their means of funding. So they state that it can be a hypothetical, that they can claim that ultimately the means of funding doesn't need to be specified and the amount of funding doesn't need to be specified. Well, ultimately, in today's debate, we specify in the resolution the idea of significantly. And insofar as they haven't really detailed how they are going to be significantly increasing it and what that actually means, you can't buy their impacts. Significantly, hypothetically, could be $100 million. It doesn't really mean that much. And yes, they specify this couple $1 billion, but again, they don't say where that's going to come from or how that's really going to work. So don't buy the fact that their plan really will have any impacts to begin with, as they don't provide any specifics on when it will happen or how it will happen, nor any of the details of the process of it happening. They don't describe how much research would go in before we use them, or if we just automatically start using these fuel cells. So don't buy the specificity of their plan. So with that, let's move on to the points or the idea of time frame. Ultimately, what we see here is two issues. One, we put in a lot of research into these hydrogen fuel cells so that they can be more efficient and our usage of them can be better. But again, the deadline proposed by the affirmation is 2050. We don't have time to choose an energy source that we have to put in this much research to. We have other sources like wind or nuclear or solar that have kind of like applicable qualities now. On top of this, we see that if we don't put in this research and we implement these hydrogen fuel cells now, we see all of the disads of the negation really flowing through because we aren't finding better ways to implement this. When it comes to time frame, you see two issues. Again, if they do it now, we see all of the disads happening. And if they do it later, we're not fitting into the time frame of 2050 that they said we need a solution by. So next, let's move on to the points brought up by the affirmation. First, on green energy. So they describe this idea that ultimately this is a green energy source and is necessary and beneficial. A couple of responses. One, again, it is costly. This is not a cheap form of energy source. And whether we significantly increase it or not, ultimately what we see here is it's not that necessarily the best energy source, both for the US to use or for the world to use, because ultimately not every country has the same ability to spend that the US does. So again, if we influence the rest of the world, this isn't a good thing to kind of show that the rest of the world should be pursuing. Next, on this idea of renewability. Yes, this is a green energy source in that it is zero emissions, but ultimately, not only is it non-renewable in that the rare earth elements needed to produce it are running out, both in the status quo and would increase later, but ultimately what we see here is that it's the process of building and finding the rare earth elements to build them ultimately has carbon emissions anyway. So ultimately the net impact still has carbon emissions occurring. So they're not really solving for climate change like they say they are going to be. Next, on this idea of global, again, if we do influence the rest of the world, we will run out of rare earth elements sooner and ultimately have a less sustainable kind of like source of energy that we are implementing both in the US and influencing globally. So on the second contention of rural impacts. First, this is not unique. Whatever source of green energy we use, we are essentially solving for these issues of energy shortages in rural areas. Ultimately, it doesn't have to be the hydrogen fuel cells that the affirmation is proposing. So because of the many harms of these fuel cells, this is not the best way to solve energy shortages in rural areas. Second, we need these solutions now. We don't need to have these energy shortages, these impacts on rural areas and low-income communities are happening now. Again, we need research into these hydrogen fuel cells. They are not ready to be implemented now. Even the affirmation discusses this concept of research. So if we need to solve this issue, again, hydrogen fuel cells are not the best way to do that, as that benefit to these communities cannot happen now. On top of this, again, they don't have the infrastructure to support this, so really the impacts are lessened. Next, on this idea of perpetuating issues. Again, not only are they perpetuating unsafe issues, as we discussed in our second contention regarding the mining of rare earth elements in China, but they also increase this by ultimately meaning that the United States is increasing its use and reliance upon rare earth elements. And again, the world's reliance on these. Second, we perpetuate this idea of harming individuals who aren't being benefited. Again, if we're mining rare earth elements in China and the US is using this energy source, we're ultimately putting people at risk that aren't even in the US, right? These people aren't even benefiting, and yet we're still perpetuating the harming of them and their well-being. Next, on this idea of renewable energy. Again, they are perpetuating a non-renewable source. Rare earth elements are running out, and rare earth elements will run out faster in the affirmation world. This is not a renewable energy source, and thus not a viable solution towards climate change. There are better options. And six, on this idea of uniqueness. Again, any of the benefits they describe ultimately can be accessed by other forms of green energy. Even if not to the same efficient extent, we ultimately see that the unique harms of increasing our use of rare earth elements and ultimately perpetuating the unsafe practices that are associated with them that we discussed in our points ultimately shows you how uniquely this has harms, while it doesn't really have any substantive unique benefits. For these reasons, we negate. Sorry.
Okay, quick off-time roadmap. I'm just going to be going over 3 voter issues. It's going to be framework, solvency, and ethical concerns. All right, so okay, time starts now. First thing to address is the framework for today's debate. The affirmative never really responded to the burden that we put on them. The AF burden needs to provide a means of significantly increasing the research or whatever on hydrogen fuel cell technology, just an increase in funding. It needs to be significant, and they need to provide a means for this. But that's something that they simply cannot do. And you can just cross-apply our contention about the non-renewability of rare earth elements that are necessary to be able to produce this. They don't have a means of doing this. They don't really give you a specific amount of funding. Even if they can't give you like a specific number, still we need to look at the fact that an impact that they try to access is accessibility. But something can only be accessible if it's cheap to produce. And it's not cheap to produce right now because we don't have rare earth elements. And right now it is very costly to produce. So in order for them to even be able to access their impacts in rural areas and making this accessible to other people, this simply just doesn't happen in the world, which is why this is also an issue of solvency. And the negation burden is only to prove that the affirmative world lacks solvency or creates unique harms, which they do. So onto this idea of solvency. Government does not solve for climate change. When we're looking to this idea of climate change, they didn't address how REEs are not renewable. And the mining of REEs in and of itself produces environmental harms. It produces CO2. It produces just as much as it would if we didn't do it. And then you could also buy our link that, you know, the United States, by increasing the use of it, their own case states that, well, if the United States does this and sets an example, then more people are going to do this. More countries are going to do this. Their own example within their second convention is our link that proves that by doing this, they have the unique harm in expediting the mining or extraction of rare earth elements, creating this unique harm of environmental impacts and ethical concerns. Meanwhile, they don't really solve for climate change because, as we said before, this causes, for every ton of rare earth elements, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. And if REE mining produces such a substantial environmental impact and that contributes to the climate problem more than it mitigates, then there's an issue of purpose. There's an issue of solvency. If the affirmative plan can't solve for this, you can't vote on it. So when we're looking to this idea of climate change and the idea of which side can provide the most net impacts or the least net harms with the most net benefits, you can see that by voting for neg and by not passing the affirmative plan, we avoid these costs. So most importantly, we also need to look at the idea of ethical concerns, which is another voter issue. And the affirmative never really clashed with this. They never really addressed the ethical concerns that are happening. This mining is taking child labor. This mining is happening in villages where it's causing cancer villages. It's also seeping into groundwater, so people are having less of drinking water supply. And also because we're running out of REEs, it's only going to get more expensive. So they can't buy any of their impacts. They can't buy their impact for climate change because creating this creates climate change. Transporting hydrogen fuel creates climate change. Just being able to have this like sustainably creates climate change. And for all of those reasons, we can see that there's no solvency in that. They don't solve for accessibility because we're not actually increasing access in rural areas because this is going to be expensive regardless. They have no way to make this cheaper. They have no way of accessing rare earth elements in a good way. We know that by doing this, they're simply expediting all of these harms that are going to happen. They don't take into consideration of all these concerns that are happening with 440,000 tons of wastewater per day being produced by rare earth element mining. And because of all these net harms, we can see that by passing the affirmative plan text, we only see more climate change happening and more human lives being costed. So when we're going to this idea of green technology and the reliability, we know that hydrogen fuel cells are not reliant. It's not going to work. We know that with their plan, because of its vagueness, because they don't give you any specific ways or means of actually being able to implement this plan, we can't buy that plan. But even if you go under their assumption that this plan could pass, and hypothetically, we just look towards this hypothetical, we can already see that by voting for this plan, there's net harms in their world. We can see that with their framework, they lose because they don't go by the observation. Our only burden is to prove that there's unique harms, and our reliance on rare earth elements, they don't address what's going to happen when we run out. They don't address that this is a non-renewable resource. For all of these reasons, we must oppose. Thank you.
Okay. As a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be giving an overview, talking about some of the framing in the debate, going over the affirmative world, and then sort of the negation impacts. If everyone is ready, my time will start now. Ultimately, what this round comes down to is whichever side solves best for the environment. And we have proven to you that the affirmative is that side. When we look to the plan text and whether or not the affirmation is meeting its burden of significant investment, we can see that we are. Using the definition, we are assuming the plan text provides a sufficiently great amount of funding that it creates the impacts the affirmative is talking about. We can see ultimately the exact number cited is not key to the round. Even if we had given the exact number, the negation would still have read these arguments that this money wasn't doing enough, or that the cost being spent was too extreme. Ultimately, the burden of the affirmative in the round is to prove the resolution true, to prove that investing in this hydrogen fuel cell technology is a good idea and will do good. The affirmation has met this burden, and the specific definition of how many dollars are going into the plan is not a key issue in this round. So let's move on to what the affirmative is actually doing. We can see that right now, hydrogen cell technology exists and is in use. All the affirmative plan does is increases access and makes that technology better. We can see this is really important because we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. This hydrogen technology is only 5 years old, and there's already been a ton of investment. Our plan only increases this and gets this tech faster with the affirmative world. We can also see that right now we're using lots of fossil fuels, and that our opponents concede that we need some sort of green technology or some sort of improvement to ensure that we don't have the negative impacts of climate change. On top of that, we can see that rural areas have a really hard time accessing electricity, and this is impacting their ability to get education and health. So, what happens when the plan passes, when we have this sufficient amount of funding going in? We can see the current technology that exists already gets improved upon. We can see this manifest in terms of creating less emissions at the creation of this technology. It uses less materials. It becomes more powerful and energy efficient, so it can provide us more energy, and becomes cheaper and more accessible. Ultimately, we can see that it gives us the solution to our global energy crisis, a clean source of energy that does not pollute after its creation, that can be used over and over again at incredibly high efficiency rates, more so than any fossil fuel or other green technology. Our investment is not in the research on how this technology works, but in the optimization of the technology that already exists. So that now we see the clear benefits of this technology, what is the negation trying to tell you happens when we do this? The big thing they bring up is this idea of rare earth metals. While yes, there may be a small increase in the usage through this plan, we can see that it's actually more beneficial that the plan happens right now. The first reason this is because hydrogen fuel cells are more efficient and use rare earth metals more efficiently than any other technology that is using rare earth metals. It needs less than solar panels, which are already using a lot. Considering that hydrogen fuel cells become a more and more viable option, people will start redirecting the metals they use in solar panels and semiconductors into these hydrogen fuel cells, which means
POO.
yeah.
That's a new argument, like linking like solar cells like being used more to like everything. What she says and you.
My partner talks about how like it's better than solar and
How,
power.
I say specifically, we need a green technology transition. It's better for us to transition with hydrogen fuel cells as opposed to things like solar panels.
All right, time will resume now. But we can see that ultimately, because these hydrogen fuel cells are more efficient in their use of rare earth metals, we're going to be preferring having a viable hydrogen technology to solar panel technology, simply because they use less in the long run. The second reason why we're going to prefer hydrogen fuel cell here is that it lasts longer. Even if, for instance, we run out of rare earth metals 5 years earlier in the affirmation world than we would in the negation world, that doesn't really matter when it comes to green tech, because the hydrogen fuel cell lifespan is much longer than any other green technology that exists right now. And third, regardless of whether or not the plan passes, these rare earth metals are still mined and used in things like semiconductors and things like solar panels. But with the affirmative, there's a unique benefit because they are more efficiently used. They are used for a better purpose. At the point where these things are being mined anyway, these toxic things are happening anyway, we need to see how they're used and where is the best use of this limited resource. We can see that's clearly hydrogen fuel cells. When it comes to emissions, we can see they only happen at creation, and we articulate how our plan specifically helps decrease this emission and give us a more reliable source. Ultimately, they have not proved that time frame doesn't matter. We've seen that they've not proved that time frame matters. We can see the affirmative has a faster time frame for fixing climate change, for having a viable green technology that we can use as a carbon neutral alternative. The neg has not proven why this faster timeline is bad. We can see that climate change is an issue right now. The negation world doesn't do anything to solve for the bad impacts that climate change causes. The AF world is the only one that takes steps to stop that, which is why you must be voting for the affirmative. Thank you.
Nice round, y'all.
Good round.
Okay, we've both voted. Judge, would you like to give comments first?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Great job to both teams. I think you did a fantastic job on a tough topic. Ultimately, I ended up voting for the opposition because I just think that they presented their case well, given the various challenges. I think that, for me, even though we've talked about sort of what is necessary to prove in terms of solvency, the significantly increased funding was a key piece of this debate, because that is essentially one of the key issues in this general debate over use of hydrogen fuel cell technology. So while numbers were not necessarily needed by the affirmation, some explanation or an alternative to address that piece would have been helpful. Also, I thought the AF did a good job sort of countering some of the contentions made by the opposition, but not the key ones. And, they did a better job in terms of laying out all of the challenges with the use of hydrogen fuel cells, the disadvantages, the REEs, the hydrogen extraction, and what the damages of those could be, and the investment required to extract hydrogen in order for it to be used. So overall, I think that they did a good job in laying out their case.
Okay, so I came to the different conclusion. I voted for the Gov, and a couple of my reasons for this are as follows. So I myself didn't find the arguments over solvency as persuasive. I felt as though in a debate where it's talking about the expansion of government funding in a particular area, I buy that the government can allocate more money to a program. I did not find that the arguments over significant as persuasive, but I did take that into consideration, that the AF probably could have been a bit clearer with where the funding would be, of like what is meant by significantly increased funding. The main way I made my judgment was on impacts and uniqueness. I buy the negative impacts of rare earth mining, but I also buy the AF's counterclaim that this is happening in the status quo. We're already seeing the use of rare earth mining to fuel other avenues. So I felt like the AF's claim is the balance, is it on balance better to go to invest in hydrogen fuel cells or not? And I felt like their arguments over their use of being more efficient in the long term, that hydrogen fuel cells' use of rare earth metals are more efficient than other greener sources of fuel cells, was persuasive. And also in terms of impacts, if we're agreeing that we're already digging up rare earth materials, then surely with the other impact we're looking at is the long-term influences of climate change. So to be extremely cruel about it, if we're looking at a cancer village or the extinction of humanity, if we're taking it purely on terms of balance of the balance of probability, the balance of impact, it would be voting for the extinction of all life on Earth is worse than the negative impacts of rare earth materials, especially if we're already using those. Let me just double check if I put anything else that specifically stood out. Yes, I thought a good argument that was put forward by Eubank was highlighting that we have other alternative means of addressing climate change, which already exist, and we don't necessarily need to be investing in hydrogen fuel cells. However, I feel like that also runs up against the problem of the status quo, which is we already are using rare earth materials for that. And so that kind of rubs up against another area of the next case. Overall, I thought both teams were very good. I felt they both put out their arguments very well. It was a difficult decision for me to make, and I made my decision purely based off like the uniqueness of the different arguments put forward, as well as the on balance, which side had more benefits than harms. Is that clear? Do you have any questions?
Any questions?
I just have a question. So, just like about the round, like, do you think that would have helped us if we had a counter plan?
For me, not necessarily. I feel like a counter plan is always nice to have. I'm always willing to listen to a counter plan. If ultimately I agree with one of your contentions, which is ultimately you don't necessarily have to put forward a counter plan. You just have to prove that the AF's claims would cause unique harms. And although the use of rare earth metals is damaging and is harmful, I feel like a better unique harm you could argue for is something along the lines of opportunity cost. So would this increase in funding on a wild goose chase for a possible hydrogen fuel cells, or should we instead better invest in tried and tested and proven technologies like nuclear? Like, you could argue that could be a counter argument that would have worked for me, I think.
Yeah, and I think that the second speaker was going there with the alternatives, but maybe a little bit of focus there would have been great. It's a tough argument because you can make a good case, particularly with rare earth mining, right, for the government. And so I think in some ways it's a little bit more challenging, but I think that in my view, you really sort of hit all of the major challenges and disadvantages of using hydrogen fuel cell technology. So from that perspective, you were great. And even, the argument that, well, if we're using up so much REs, it doesn't mean that we increase that. And that goes again to the argument of, okay, what else could we do towards, going back to that goes towards the opportunity costs. How can we sort of maximize or optimize usage, which actually I think the government brought up at one point and did a good job there, but that could have been used for the next case, the opposition's case as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the feedback and for judging.
No,
and thank you to our
Thank you.
opponents. Good luck, guys.
Yes, best of luck for the rest of the day. You were both great.
Thank you. Good luck to you.